Welcome back to the Daily Drum on WHUR and Sirius XM Channel 141. This is the Insight segment. I'm Harold Fisher. Tonight, in custody law enforcement deaths. There is supposed to be a national database to collect federal, state, and local records about these incidents, but my guests say the transparency is simply not there, leading to more lives lost, especially in Black and Brown communities. And of course, now President Trump has signed an executive order pulling the plug on a federal system for doing background checks on law enforcement officers. And then there is AI. It may be leading to more wrongful arrests. But what does all of this mean for keeping bad apples out of law enforcement, protecting those in police custody, and preventing wrongful arrests? Well, we're talking to the Hip Hop Caucus tonight. My guests are Dr. Cynthia Swan, Chief of Staff, Brittany Bell-Surratt, Senior Director of Storytelling and Communications, and Jarrell Clay, Senior Director of Digital and Production, all of them at the Hip Hop Caucus. Thank you all so much for joining us for this really important conversation.
Thank you for
having us.
Sure thing. A couple of quick facts here. Death in Custody Reporting Act, established in 2014, requires every law enforcement agency at the state, federal, territory level to collect information on the deaths of people transported, detained, or arrested by law enforcement, and of course, those who died while incarcerated or in custody. Now, the new report shows that those figures are not being accurately or consistently reported. Also, the NLEAD, or National Law Enforcement Accountability Database, launched in 2023, a one-stop shop of professional records for federal law enforcement officers. That goal to allow prospective employers to check the backgrounds of officers for misconduct. President Trump has ordered that system taken offline. Before we kind of get into the conversation, for those who may not be familiar with the Hip Hop Caucus, Dr. Swan, please share with us kind of what the organization is about.
Well, the Hip Hop Caucus is really an organization that is focused in and on our community specifically, obviously broadly along the issues that impact us. We are a civil rights and social justice organization that is firmly focused around climate justice. Justice Paid in Full is one of our platforms. That's about economic justice. The Good Troubled platform is around our human and civil rights work. We also have Respect My Vote, which is our campaign that is focused solely on how our vote needs to matter. And then we have our Think 100%, which is our climate justice platform. And this organization focuses on the 18 to 40 demographic. And I believe that what you'll find is that while we are a multi-generational organization, because Hip Hop Caucus is multi-generational, that our focus, our team are very dedicated and committed individuals in the very age demographic that we are focused on. Mm-hmm. And they are doing a phenomenal job in terms of ensuring that the messages and the concerns that impact our communities and frontline communities, the BIPOC communities specifically, are recognized and that our people remain informed.
I see. One of the things that I did want to ask you, Dr. Swan, is as it relates to how the Trump administration is making changes to these databases, and especially as it relates to NLEAD, the National Law Enforcement Accountability Database, taking it offline. What is your reaction to it? What is your concern?
Well, I have a number of concerns. I think that the one of the biggest changes and challenges that we have is that if we don't know where individuals, police officers, law enforcement, where these folks are that are having difficulty in terms of executing their duties, then we don't have an opportunity to figure out what that correction process looks like. The database was one of the most significant advances that we had in police accountability, along with the Deaths in Custody Act and the other things that were coming along. And so for that database to be taken offline just allows for police to basically operate without credibility, without oversight, without consequences, without an opportunity for the legislative bodies and others to critique the work of the police departments in their respective jurisdictions. But the most significant piece of it being taken offline is the fact that we don't know where these officers are, and we don't know what consequences or accountability measures are in place for them.
Mm-hmm. More broadly, Brittany, from your perspective, what might this mean, particularly for Black and Brown communities, to Dr. Swan's point? If a veteran officer moves to another department, you don't know whether or not that officer is moving because he's got an ailing mother in that community and he needed to switch jobs, or whether he was a bad apple.
Yeah, it's very real consequences for the families of folks who have been impacted by police killing or police brutality. Myself being one, I lost my brother in 2023 to being killed by sheriff's office in Natchez, Mississippi. So, I think for families, particularly being able to see these officers go on without consequence. You already have many who aren't serving any jail time. In this administration, we're seeing the constant pardoning. We saw that in DC just this week, where those 2 officers returned back to the workforce after being pardoned. And so it hurts because, that culturally what you're saying is that they are above the law when they should be serving the law, and that just, kind of standard consequences where you wouldn't be rehired at a job if you did something, physically assaulted your boss, nevertheless, or a colleague, nevertheless, killed somebody on a job, you wouldn't be rehired. So seeing that it's a real consequence to the families.
To the point that you were making, for those who may not be familiar with what you were discussing, Officer Terrence Sutton and Lieutenant Andrew Zabavsky with the Metropolitan Police Department were reinstated. They had been convicted in the death of 20-year-old Karan Hilton. Now that had happened several years ago, but as we know, as you were saying, that they were pardoned by President Trump and they were reinstated to full duty just this past Monday. But there were so many other examples of these kinds of situations. And I think even more importantly, even if we're not talking about in custody deaths, but we're just talking about police officers who have been disciplined and maybe even disciplined, several times, and then as a result, they are fired. What do you think the long-term implications of this may be, Dr. Swan, if we don't know what these officers have done now because this information is no longer available? Or what does that mean for hiring managers, sheriffs? What does that mean for police chiefs who are still constantly looking to fill their ranks and compete with other departments?
I think there are a lot of things that come into play with that. I think that these databases that track incidents of police violence and misconduct. It assists in a number of ways in terms of police officers, to your question, or chiefs who are looking to hire. But I think that a lot of what we have to consider is that whole erosion of accountability and transparency, the loss of data oversight. These databases obviously tracking excessive use of force, racial profiling, and complaints against these officers would be very critical information for anyone who's looking to hire an officer who is moving to another area, and removing these databases obscure that and those patterns of misconduct. I think that you'd be looking at the increased risk of abuse. They have to be concerned about whether that is what we're looking at and what we may have to deal with in determining where these officers are and where they're looking to go, where they may know that there's not as much scrutiny in terms of where they transition into another area and another community. I think that police departments have to also be concerned about the perception of cover-up. Communities, especially those in our BIPOC communities, really believe that police violence, racial profiling, and other things, if you remove that database, that's an intentional step to shield law enforcement from scrutiny. And of course, that in turn minimizes any kind of accountability that they would have. And I think if the policymakers don't know what's happening and don't have this data to use, then that's an obstacle to policy change in terms of state and local police departments. How will policymakers mandate an oversight of those departments if they don't have this basic knowledge? And the disproportionate impact on our marginalized communities goes without saying, not to mention the obstruction of justice that just has overbearing civil rights implications for all of us.
Jarrell, I want to bring you into the conversation specifically as it relates to AI, artificial intelligence. It is everywhere. It is used in the new computer equipment that we're buying, on websites. But as it relates to law enforcement, it is a new tool for identifying suspects and doing other kinds of police work. But what do you believe are the deleterious implications of AI in identifying suspects? And I speak specifically about suspects of color.
Absolutely, Harold. When we talk about AI as it relates to how we can use it to identify criminals, we have to understand the newness of this technology and also who developed the technology. If the technology was developed by folks who do not look like people of color, then there is inherently bias in the tools that they develop. And so there have been situations where you don't have the right type of tool tracking who the proposed subject would be. And in those moments, you have folks who are identified incorrectly, folks who are wrongly accused and then taken into custody from that wrongful conviction based on an AI captured evidence that they have done something that they clearly did not. And before we can use AI effectively in this kind of system for tracking, we have to understand, and then with that understanding, based on data, implement and hire and recruit folks who can build in that technology for AI to use that system, but we just aren't there yet.
Hold that point. I need to take a really quick break, but don't forget you can hear this and every edition of the Daily Drum Insight segment via podcast on WHUR.com. The Original Quiet Storm with Raheem Devon is next on WHUR. I'm Harold Fisher. This conversation continues on Sirius XM channel 141 and 96.3 HD2 in just a few seconds. Welcome back to the Daily Drum on Sirius XM channel 141. I'm Harold Fisher. We continue our conversation about in-custody deaths, police brutality, and the National Law Enforcement Accountability Database. My guests are from the Hip Hop Caucus, Dr. Cynthia Swan is Chief of Staff. Brittany Bell Surratt is Senior Director of Storytelling and Communications, and Jarrell Clay is Senior Director of Digital and Production for the Hip Hop Caucus. Jarrell, before the break, we were talking about AI and police work and the impact on communities of color. I do remember a couple of years ago where we saw a 60 Minutes piece that discussed how people of color can be misidentified by artificial intelligence. And before the break, you were talking about people of color who develop AI not being, if I may make a Hamilton reference, not in the room where it happens. Talk to me a little bit more about that.
Well, this also goes into hiring decisions about who's developing the technology. We see all across the tech sector where many of these organizations and companies within their own hiring practice do not recruit in places that people of color, particularly talented individuals from across the spectrum, whether they come from PWIs, HBCUs, et cetera, that talent pool just isn't being sought after when we look at opportunities within the technology industry to develop these tools. And so it starts, in many cases, it starts from there in order for companies to get it right and have systems that are unbiased baked into their tools so that when they do contract this out to federal, state, and local governments, it is done with the idea that they're able to accurately track who it is that they're trying to identify, as opposed to the technology that we have data to support is a bit flawed when we try to locate people of color.
Yeah, that, and Brittany, drilling down on that a little bit more, shouldn't we expect that those who are developing AI should know better? I know that's a rhetorical question.
Yeah, well, I think the expectations that we have of these people are probably too high. That's the expectation. You know, when we think about the rollbacks of DEI, this made me think about that because at its most infantile piece, DEI is about just hiring a person of color to fill a quota. But what we do know about DEI is that it is part of a problem solver for things and issues like this that Jarrell brought up. When you don't have people of color that are reflective in the technologies and the systems that they are contributing to in the workforce, then these types of blind spots and these type of erroneous behavioral problems through the technology exist. And so, you know, that it's all intersectional. And there are very real consequences for what's happening, particularly in this administration. And we're seeing it at different points, from DEI to AI to these policies in which police officers are steady being able to scapegoat the law.
What do you believe are the real world consequences? Is this a thing of an arrest being made and someone saying, that's not me? And
yeah, I think that's like very much just that, and it's been real, and we've seen it. I think the Washington Post also had an article on it about these erroneous AI, saying that this person was somebody that they wasn't, the misguidance on it. And so technology is not perfect, just like people aren't perfect. And what ends up happening is where you can end up making a human-based decision, AI doesn't have that yet. And we don't know if they will ever have that. That human piece is important. And I also think that that with that, there's a lack of accountability by, being able to pass the buck onto the AI technology, then it absolves you from being accountable for your own, misidentifying a person. And so all of this to me seems like and this is just to me, seems like a very intentional. We are trying to get as many people as possible off the hook for basically brutalizing and terrorizing Black communities.
What do you think are the implications of it as well, Dr. Swan, because as we all know, all Black and brown people look alike. So.
Well, I think that we, to the point that's been made here already, that we know that AI does not eliminate bias. It automates and scales that bias, but I don't think that any of us are naive enough to believe that it eliminates it. And the technology has been proven to continually misidentify people of color and at disproportionate rates, which is leading to these wrongful arrests and further criminalization. I think that with law enforcement increasingly integrating AI with body cameras and drones and social media monitoring and all of that, they're creating a surveillance state to me with minimum oversight in terms of what if and what does it mean when you're doing it wrong. And I think also that I think that they're trying to say to us that AI is providing a greater safety for us. And I think that if anything, it's leading to over-policing and these unnecessary arrests and a deeper entrenchment, if anything, of racial and economic disparities. And so if an AI tool can falsely identify a suspect, lead to a wrongful termination, a wrongful prosecution, or contributes to excessive policing, who's going to be held accountable? The police department, the tech company, the AI guru? Yeah. Where is this? And because it's often deployed without any consent or independent oversight, I think there are legal frameworks that we are not even dealing with. So it's a political decision. AI and law enforcement is a political decision. And I think it must be scrutinized as such. And we need to hold legislators and others accountable for allowing AI to infiltrate our communities. And we need to figure out what, in fact, we're going to do, because it's not making law enforcement smarter or fairer. But in reality, it's deepening the very injustices that it claims to solve. That's what I think about it.
I do want your reaction on some other news today, Dr. Swan, and certainly Brittany, and even Jarrell, you're certainly to chime in as well. As you know, over the past couple of days, there's been kind of a dust up where a conservative podcaster and even Elon Musk, the man in charge of the Department of Government Efficiency, has said that the president should consider pardoning Derek Chauvin, the man who murdered George Floyd. Now, just today, the reporting is that the president says he is not considering pardoning Derek Chauvin. Just to drill down a little bit more, obviously, and Dr. Swan, you are the legal background certainly as it relates to, or the legal expert as it relates to this particular conversation. Derek Chauvin's murder charges were state charges; they were not federal. The civil rights charges, federal, not state. But what are your thoughts in that there are allies of the president that are even bringing this issue up?
Well, I think it speaks to the serious condition and the incredible concern that we all should have as it relates to our democracy broadly. But I will say that a potential presidential pardon of Derek Chauvin for the murder of George Floyd would be a profound miscarriage of justice. And it would be a direct assault on the rule of law, civil rights, and public trust in the legal system broadly. Chauvin was convicted by a jury of his peers and sentenced under due process for an act of brutal, lethal misconduct. And I think a pardon would not only undermine our legal process, but also send a dangerous message that law enforcement officers can engage in whatever egregious abuses of power they can and evade accountability from political intervention. And from an advocacy perspective, such a move would be a fundamental attack on the basic principles of justice and civil rights. If a pardon is issued, advocacy organizations have to mobilize swiftly on that, because not that one could be issued based on the basic concept of that is a state issue, that was a state indictment, it was a state conviction, and so the federal government has no call to action there. But I think that this would be a moment that requires a sharp, coordinated response by all involved, if in fact we would be going to a point that we would allow such an action to happen, such a pardon to be issued.
Yeah, and as I said, those state charges are not eligible for a federal pardon by the president. Jarrell, I know I'm going to lose you in a bit, and I'll get to Brittany in a bit, but if you wanted to have some share your thoughts about the whole Derek Chauvin, George. Thank you. Your thoughts about that, if you don't mind.
Absolutely, and I appreciate Dr. Swan offering the legal aspect here. I think there's also there's an organizing fight and there's a narrative fight that we are also enduring in this moment. And I'll hand it to Brittany to talk about the narrative fight. But from an organizing perspective, when we think about everything that we had to do over the last few decades to ensure that we have these processes in place, and we see the current administration eroding decades of some of that progress with the stroke of a pen, this is the moment where we decide who we're going to be in this moment. How do we mobilize on the state and local level, but also what do we do federally to make sure that some of our demands for justice not only ring true and loud among the halls of Congress, but they reverberate all throughout the country on a state and local level, which goes more or less to our civic engagement work, where we're encouraging our activists to vote in some of the 100,000 seats that are available across the United States right now in 2025 elections. We hear a lot of rhetoric about what we can do in 4 years or 2 years, but there are absolutely things that we can do now to make sure that the justice that we've already earned is also protected.
Jarrell Clay, thank you so much. I appreciate your time and your participation in this conversation. Thank you so much. Brittany, your thoughts about the George Floyd, Derek Chauvin question.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to really ask ourselves, what is the obsession with pardoning police who have killed Black men or Black people? That obsession wasn't there when there was a pardoning of the January 6th defendants, and there were police who had been killed and attacked during that. Calling a spade a spade, I think that it is of my own personal opinion that the white supremacy here is part of this administration's message to folks, and that we will back up the actions to show you that this is a new regime and this is what's going to happen. And so what we saw with, again, taking this back to the DEI measures that we saw happen after the George Floyd killing, and all of these corporations that had pledges and in implementing new systems on hiring and in assessing their bias and all of that. Those are those same corporations connected to that same killing that are doing these repeals and these rollbacks. And so I think that having JD Vance applaud the venture capitalist group that hired Daniel Penny, the Marine that killed the guy in New York, and then they had him in the box at the athletic game. This is a message that these people are trying to send, not only through the policies, not only through how they show up on the screen and through their rhetoric. This is something that they're trying to make very clear. And so those are my thoughts on it. Like I said, this is a very personal issue to me. And we can't allow the continued contradictions that they have about caring for police lives when we see that very contradiction happen with the pardons of the insurrectionists from January 6th.
If you don't mind, because as you said, this is very personal, and you mentioned the death of your brother in Mississippi, would you mind sharing some of that with us so that people will understand that this is an anybody and everybody situation, and it's not just something that just happens to just a few people?
Sure. A couple of years ago, my brother was involved in a domestic dispute where, police end up being called, and there was, an exchange of gunfire. There was a mental health wellness check that happened just the day prior to my brother being killed. And so, this is something where I've seen the video from of body cam footage from the time that the police came to the house, and to the time that there was an exchange of gunfire, and to the time that my brother sat on the ground for 20 something minutes before the ambulance arrived, and just bled out before another 4 hours, if not more, but at least another 4 to 6 hours in which he just laid on the ground until the name of the body.
Medical examiner?
The
Examiner?
to the examiner had to come from like the coast. So there was only like one or two in the state. Mm-hmm. And so they had to come from somewhere else. But
it is personal.
Yeah, it's personal.
It is personal. And I think to that point, as we look at some of the other things that are happening around police departments in this country, and the new Trump administration, where the president, through executive orders, was lifting consent decrees, and the back and forth of the courts of saying, no, you can't lift police consent decrees, because, for example, in Cleveland, with the Cleveland Police Department, but there are police departments across the country, big and small, that are having issues. And just like anything else, we know that, yes, these departments are run by human beings, and human beings are infallible. They have these fallacies. They are imperfect, Dr. Swan. But if nobody is watching them, if nobody is asking questions about what they're doing, particularly when there are lives lost or misconduct, what does this mean for not only Black and brown communities, but the country as a whole?
Well, I think that we have to understand that the whole idea, and I must apologize to your audience for the
That's all
fact
right.
having difficulty with these alerts. But I think we have to understand that the consent decrees they need to understand what they are. They're legally binding agreements between the Department of Justice and local police departments aimed at implementing reforms within these departments and to be able to identify excessive use of force, racial profiling, police misconduct, and other things. And if these decrees are lifted, then we are sending a message that the federal government is retreating from its responsibility to ensure accountability in law enforcement agencies. And without these decrees, police departments, they can revert to any kind of problematic practices that they want to without any external oversight at all. And that is going to further erode public trust in these communities. Our communities, especially our communities, have historically been subjected to police abuse. And so we're going to view the removal of consent decrees as a sign that it's open warfare on us. This means that you can just come after and do anything that you want. And so it's undermining civil rights protections, any kind of civil rights violations or anything else that happens will not have the scrutiny that it needs to have if these decrees are lifted. And also, any type of systemic change that we can look for is not going to occur as long as they're not in place, these decrees. So lifting the decree is going to set back a lot of the national reforms that we're moving forward. And diminishing oversight is just another way of victimizing our communities even more.
Brittany, from your perspective, what do you believe should be the call to action for people who are listening to this conversation or aware what the Hip Hop Caucus is doing to ensure that there is support for some of these initiatives? 2 steps forward, 50 steps back already. And so it's almost like you got to start all over again just to get back to the initial fight.
Yeah. Anybody wanting to work with Hip Hop Caucus and on this can always can follow us at Hip Hop Caucus. For folks, we are getting ready to really launch some meet the people where they are organizing and mobilizing tactics. So doing more in-person town halls around not only this issue, but some of our other issues, letter writing campaigns, joining our email campaign, a few ways in which people can connect with us. And we are here as a conduit between the people and the policy that we want to progress. And so, yeah, I would say those things.
Yeah. Do you believe, Dr. Swan, that there is a way to keep people energized and mobilized? Because as we know, there are some people can be oversaturated with information, and some people can be sick and tired of just being sick and tired, and they want to throw their hands up. How do you keep people mobilized? How do you keep people in the fight for these kinds of issues that are impacting Black and Brown communities?
Well, I do believe that people are oversaturated at this point, and they are almost feeling as though they don't know what to do next. And I think that is something that I know at the caucus we are focused on. I believe that the broader piece is to make certain that we can make the issues that are coming about relevant. It's almost as though you have to make the issues that don't appear to be bread and butter issues for folks. You need to tie it into the bread and butter issue so that they understand it does matter. And I believe that if in fact we can begin to have folks to see why and how issues such as police accountability or deaths in custody or a number of other ranges of issues, climate, whatever you name, how those things really are going to impact you directly if in fact you don't become engaged. And I also believe, and this could be naive of me, but I've been around a long time. I also believe that if we can begin to have people to directly connect these things that they have great concerns with to the actions that are occurring now, and to see that they are impacting multiple communities, and if these communities can come together on these fights, that we will begin to have some momentum. Because these fights are BIPOC community fights, but they also are affecting and ultimately will affect other marginalized communities and lower income, lower socioeconomic communities as well.
This is a good place, I think, to end this conversation. If people want to find out more about the Hip Hop Caucus, where can they go online? Is there a website that you can share with us?
www.hiphopcaucus.org. We just launched our brand new website last week, so we would love for folks to come visit us there, and a rebrand as well, commemorating our 20th anniversary. And then also you can follow us on all social media platforms at Hip Hop Caucus.
Excellent. Brittany Bell Surratt, Dr. Cynthia Swan, thank you all so much for participating in this really important conversation. We also want to shout out Darrell Clay as well. He had to leave earlier. We want to thank him for his insight and his expertise. That is the Daily Drum for this Friday, March 7th. For News Director Renee Nash, I'm Harold